It seemed to work quite well, but nevertheless, since all around the fair were small children dragging balloons, also on the end of a piece of string, she couldn't help thinking that it made her look more than a little bit silly. And something that made one witch look silly made all witches look silly. On the other hand, if you tied it to a hedge somewhere, there was bound to be some kid who would untie the string and get on the stick for a dare, in which case most likely he would go straight up all the way to the top of the atmosphere where the air froze, and while she could in theory call the stick back, mothers got very touchy about having to thaw out their children on a bright late summer day. That would not look good. People would talk. People always talked about witches. She resigned herself to dragging it again. With luck, people would think she was joining in with the spirit of the thing in a humorous way. There was a lot of etiquette involved, even at something so deceptively cheerful as a fair. She was the witch. Who knows what would happen if she forgot someone's name, or, worse still, got it wrong? What would happen if you forgot all the little feuds and factions, the people who weren't talking to their neighbours, and so on, and a lot more so, and even further on? Tiffany had no understanding at all of the word minefield, but if she had, it would have seemed kind of familiar. She was the witch. For all the villages along the chalk, she was the witch. Not just her own village anymore, but for all the other ones as far away as Ham on Rye, which was a pretty good day's walk from here. The area that a witch thought of as her own, and for whose people she did what was needful, was called a steading. And as steadings went, this one was pretty good. Not many witches got a whole geological outcrop to themselves, even if this one was mostly covered in grass and the grass was mostly covered in sheep. And today, the sheep on the downs were left by themselves to do whatever it was they did when they were by themselves, which would presumably be pretty much the same as they did if you were watching them. And the sheep, usually fussed and herded and generally watched over, were now of no interest whatsoever, because right here, the most wonderful attraction in the world was taking place. Admittedly, the Scouring Fair was only one of the world's most wonderful attractions if you didn't usually ever travel more than about 4 miles from home. If you lived around the chalk, you were bound to meet everyone that you knew at the fair.
Speaking as a witch, she knew them very well.
It was quite often where you met the person you were likely to marry. The girls certainly all wore their best dresses, while the boys wore expressions of hopefulness and their hair smoothed down with cheap hair pomade or, more usually, spit. Those who had opted for spit generally came off better, since the cheap pomade was very cheap indeed and would often melt and run in the hot weather, causing the young men not to be of interest to the young women, as they had fervently hoped, but to the flies, who would make their lunch off their scalps. However, since the event could hardly be called the fair where you went in the hope of getting a kiss and, if your luck held, the promise of another one, the fair was called the Scouring. The Scouring was held over 3 days at the end of summer. For most people on the chalk, it was their holiday. This was the 3rd day, and most people said that if you hadn't had a kiss by now, you might as well go home. Tiffany hadn't had a kiss. But after all, she was the witch. Who knew what they might get turned into? If the late summer weather was clement, it wasn't unusual for some people to sleep out under the stars and under the bushes as well. And that was why, if you wanted to take a stroll at night, it paid to be careful so as not to trip over someone's feet. Not to put too fine a point to it, there was a certain amount of what Nanny Og, a witch who had been married to 3 husbands, called making your own entertainment. It was a shame that Nanny lived right up in the mountains, because she would have loved the Scouring, and Tiffany would have loved to see her face when she saw the giant.